This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, my guest is Nick Lane, a biochemist who has written a number of books on evolution on Earth, and we will be talking specifically about his book, The Vital Question, but also dealing with other things that he has written about in his career. The conversation will begin in a moment. Life on Earth and its evolution is the topic of this show. The man before you is Nick Lane. He is a biochemist who has written a number of books on this very topic. As I usually like to do, though, I want to give him a few minutes to give a little bit of background about who he is, where he came from, his ideas, and his overall view on the subject. So welcome, Nick, and if you could give a little background.
Hi, thank you very much. Yes, so I'm a biochemist. I'm at University College London. And I work on some of the most fascinating questions that anybody could wish to work on. Origin of life, for example, and the early evolution of cells, and why the building blocks that make us up, ourselves, the cells, came to be the way they are, and so why it is that they have the structure that they do, and how that affects our own lives in the end. So I've written several books, 4 books in fact, about this. Going right back to the origins of life and right forward to our own lives and deaths, why aging, for example, happens, questions like that. The rest of the time, I'm a biochemist in the lab at UCL. I teach. I do my research mostly on the origin of life. We have a reactor where we try to simulate the conditions that we think might have given rise to the origin of life.
Well, I want to start off with a question that's actually philosophical before we get into the physiological and the mechanics of life, and that is that some scientists have talked about the 3 Big Bangs, believing that there's the Big Bang that created the cosmos, then the Big Bang of life here on Earth, and then the Big Bang of sentience as that developed. So my question would be, without life, would the universe as a whole basically not exist? Do you think that that life has some kind of animating force? You know, some philosophers believe that existence, reality, is what life perceives. Do you believe something like that, or do you look at things in a biochemical sense?
I tend to be fairly straightforward in my thoughts. Actually, I think the universe exists anyway, and would exist regardless of whether there was life in it or not. I think we're remarkably lucky that we are about the only species, certainly that we are aware of, that's able to kind of try to understand our place in the universe. The planet is absolutely full of life, and most of it probably is unable to comprehend what it's doing here. So I certainly think the universe exists anyway, and probably most of the universe is lifeless.
Yeah.
It would be nice to think there's life elsewhere, but we really don't know.
Well, let's talk about life on Earth. When I was growing up, and I was born in 1965, the warm pool, or variations of it, was the dominant idea of how life got started, that somewhere in a puddle somewhere, some chemicals were floating around, a lightning bolt came, and voila, life erupted or whatnot. Is that the dominant view now, or do we have 2 or 3 other alternatives? Like I've heard how cells may have developed in certain forms of clay because of consistency or whatnot. How do you feel that life actually began on Earth if it's not the warm pool?
Well, I think in deep ocean hydrothermal vents, there is no real agreement about how life started. That's a group of us think this. There's quite a lot of evidence for it now. Still, people do also believe in Darwin's warm pond, or in some kind of a primordial soup. There's lots of experiments have been done, but it's very difficult to do an experiment that proves very much about the origin of life. And so you can do an experiment. A lot of people will be familiar with the Miller-Urey experiment, where flashes of lightning through an atmosphere containing gases like methane and ammonia gives rise to amino acids, so the building blocks of proteins. No, it's true, it works, and it's possible to do lots of chemistry that way, but it's been really impossible to get any further than that, and so it's hard to say what evidence is that other than it's possible to make amino acids under that set of conditions. You can also get amino acids on meteorites, for example, produced by cosmic chemistry. They can also be produced in hydrothermal vents. It seems to be quite easy actually, to make simple organic molecules, but to make them in large amounts, to make them in some kind of structure to provide for growth and the properties that living cells actually have, that's been much more difficult, and we haven't really got very close to it yet. And so there isn't much agreement in the field about where life started. In my view, as I say, it was in deep sea hydrothermal vents, and there's a lot of good things about that make them more like cells than the other environments.
Well, what is the thing that you think turned mere chemistry into biochemistry? Is there a catalyzing event or thing that can change the random mix of chemicals into something that, life, as I was taught as a boy, moves, life can reproduce, life can breathe, life, what is it? What do you think? What changes from it? It's like the difference between a live person a minute before they die and then they're dead and they're not alive anymore. What made chemistry into biochemistry?
Yes, well, it's exactly that. I think you put your finger on it with a person who's died. The only difference over that second or two that we are aware of as scientists is that they've stopped breathing, that respiration has stopped at that point, and that's the one thing that keeps us alive. If you want to be dead in 1 minute, put a plastic bag over your head, and that's it. So it's this continuous reaction which is going on, which is what respiration is. So we are burning food in oxygen continuously, and if we stop doing that, then we die. And the organization of the cell is provided for that. Growth is provided for by that. So some force, I'm using respiration in a broader sense now, so all life does that, all life including bacteria and so on. They don't necessarily burn food in oxygen. They may, for example, effectively eat rocks. Yeah. And they may burn those rocks with more rocks. It's they can take electrons from one place and dump them somewhere else, and that's the same process basically. That's how breathing works, and that's what's going on down in these deep sea hydrothermal vents. You have a continuous flow, a continuous reaction, which is able to drive the kind of chemistry of life we think. But it's very similar to life in the sense that it's a continuous flux. You've got these fluids coming from reactions going on down deeper in the crust, and as soon as they get into the ocean, there's a lack of equilibrium. They will react together, and they will keep reacting together because they're continuously refurnished. And that's really the kind of conditions I think we need to be looking for the origin of life, is this continuous reaction that can make other things happen.
And is this anaerobic life that started out and then it mutated to become oxygen and photosynthesis and these things that we associate with life on the surface of Earth? But you would claim that, I guess, that life probably started powered by the heat of the Earth itself then, correct?
It's not the heat of the Earth. It's effectively electrons coming out from within the Earth. So gases, for example, like hydrogen. In fact, it's not a million miles away from the Miller-Urey type gases that come out of these vents. You do have some methane. You do have hydrogen, and it's going into an ocean which was relatively poor in electrons. So there we have gases like carbon dioxide, and there was no oxygen back then. We're pretty certain about that. But there may have been other relatively oxidized gases, perhaps a little bit of nitrogen oxides, things like that. We don't really know. So the reaction is probably between the hydrogen coming out of the vents and the carbon dioxide in the waters to form organic molecules. And that reaction, which doesn't happen very easily, is powered by effectively the electrical potential across the vents themselves, the electrical difference between the fluids coming out of the vents and the fluids in the oceans, and that's driving this reaction between carbon dioxide and hydrogen to make organic molecules. So it's got nothing to do with oxygen, and oxygen would actually prevent those reactions from happening. So we can be, again, fairly certain that life is never going to start on a planet full of oxygen.
Yeah. So if you have if life did begin at these hydrothermal vents, and I've read about extremophiles, archaea, and other one-celled organisms that have lived, presumed to live farther down in the crust. Are you one of the scientists that believe that there could be as much biomass beneath the Earth's surface as above?
There could well be. I don't, to be be honest, know a great deal about just how much there is down there or how it's measured. That's not quite my field, but
Yeah.
certainly there are archaea down there. There are plenty of bacteria down there. And how much we don't really know. What we do know is that they are some of the most ancient cells around, and that they operate in ways which are very similar to the bacteria and the archaea living in these vents themselves. They do it without the power of the sun. They do it basically on the minerals coming from the rocks within the earth itself, and that seems to be the simplest forms of metabolism, the simplest ways to grow, and they seem to be as ancient as anything we know about. So they are a good model for the kind of conditions that may have given rise to life in the first place.
Do you consider viruses a living thing, or are they just sort of random floating pieces of DNA?
Well, it's a tough question, the virus. I would say they are alive, but they're alive in the context of life. And more broadly, most biologists wonder at times about some kind of definition of life. What is life? And there isn't a very satisfying answer for that question. I tend to think that all attempts to define life miss out the environment, because what life is doing generally is in some sense parasitizing the environment.
Yeah.
So we are doing it. We need to breathe oxygen, which is coming from plants. We need to eat. The plants themselves need to do it as well. They need sunlight. They need carbon dioxide, which is largely coming from animals. So they are parasitizing their environment too. And when we see life in those terms, then we can begin to see that viruses are also parasitizing their environment. It's just that viruses have an enormously rich environment, which is the cell around them.
Yeah.
So viruses are always dependent on cells, or the parts of cells, the aspects of cells that are able to do metabolism, that are able to grow, to convert their environment into copies of themselves. And viruses do essentially the same thing. They copy the environment of the metabolizers into copies of themselves. So I suspect that viruses go right the way back. Life is practically impossible without parasitism and all forms of parasitism from the very beginning.
Viruses seem to be almost like zombie life, in a sense that they need life in order to have their own life. Without other types of life, they're inert. What you said about life, though, reminded me of the beginning. I think it's an Arthur C. Clarke novel. I could be wrong. It says that life is the rust on small rocky worlds, or something like that. But let me talk about your current book or latest book, and then I'll work on some other things. What is the titular question of The Vital Question?
Well, it's the question is, why is life the way that it is? And I'm referring in that really to complex life, to at the level of cells, the kind of cells that make us up, the kind of cells that make up plants as well, and everything that's large that we can see, mushrooms, for example. We're all made of a particular type of cell, and that's a very peculiar type of cell. It's nothing like bacteria, and we have very little idea, even now, surprisingly little idea, why and how that type of cell arose. And it has so many strange properties that we all know about. Sex, for example, all these kind of cells have sex. They pretty much all have two sexes as well. So these are traits of life that we're all familiar with, but we don't know as evolutionary biologists exactly how these things arose or why they arose in the first place.
And certainly animal life is symmetrical. They either have 6 legs on one side, 6 legs on another, generally speaking. Life is sort of bifurcated, or at least animal life is bifurcated down the middle. And when I was growing up, of course, there were 2 kingdoms that we were taught of, which was the animals and the plant kingdom. And my wife now has, she works in science. She'll say, well, there's fungi, there's archaea, there's protists, and a few others. If you could rewind life back to the moment or moments when it first began, do you think that we would develop the same kingdoms that we have? I.e., do you think that that life conforms to universal laws evolutionarily, or if we rewound it, might we end up with something totally alien to our senses? I mean, are we in a sense pre-programmed to have these 7 kingdoms and symmetrical life and all this stuff?
Yeah. So the way that the tree of life breaks down has changed extraordinarily over the last 30 or 40 years or so. So we don't talk very much about kingdoms even anymore. The major
Really?
constraints, if you like, the major shape is the three domains of life, and the domains are the bacteria, the archaea, which basically look exactly the same, but in their biochemistry they're very, very different, and in their genetics they're very different. And then the eukaryotes, and now eukaryotes simply means true kernel. It's basically cells that have a nucleus, and in the nucleus they dump all the DNA. And they are on average, 10 to 100,000 times larger than bacteria and archaea. And within the eukaryotes,
we are eukaryotes. Just to
we are eukaryotes, yes. And plants are eukaryotes, and mushrooms, fungi, and so on. They are eukaryotes. So are things like amoeba. So single cells that crawl around and engulf other cells by a process called phagocytosis. It's kind of literally an engulfment. And all kinds of seaweeds and things like that. Now, the cells that we all have are remarkably similar. If you were to look at the cells of a mushroom or a seaweed down a microscope, you'd probably struggle. Most people would struggle to tell the difference between one of their own cells and a cell from a mushroom. And that's part of this question. So the tree of life has really changed shape. Now, which bits are, if you like, pre-programmed? Which bits are going to happen because of the determinism of chemistry and physics and geology, and which bits are pure chance that perhaps wouldn't happen that way again? Again, there's no agreement about any of these kind of questions. I think that I am coming at these questions from the point of view of why is it that all cells, including bacteria, respire in the same way? They have a very peculiar way of doing it. They effectively breathe across their skin, and we do the same thing deep within our own cells. We have power packs called mitochondria, which is where respiration is going on. They were bacteria once upon a time. They still have some genes of their own, and within those bacteria, they are effectively breathing across their own skin. That's how we do it as well. And so I think that this process is really central to life. It's the process of energy. Energy is transformed into growth and transformed into the carbon and the molecules that we need to grow and to live. And so it's obviously very central to life, but it's a very, very peculiar way of going about it. So a major theme of the book is, did it have to be that way? Or are there other ways of structuring energy flow in cells so that you could end up with something very, very different? And I argue that it probably didn't have to be this way, but it's certainly the most convenient way of doing it, and therefore is likely to happen in a similar way on other planets, and does structure a lot about how life works. And so we may very well end up with something similar on other planets. It's just that we have this black hole, I like to call it, right at the heart of evolution, which is the origin of complex cells, which seems to have been a bit of a freak accident.
Yeah, and Earth just had single cell life for something like 75 to 80% of the known time on Earth. And then I've read many different hypotheses. One I remember about a decade ago, where I read a book called Snowball Earth, that about 700 million years ago, that the Earth was almost frozen solid. And then that was sort of the passage with, after that, you got the Cambrian explosion of forms and whatnot. Do you agree with something like that? Or what do you think is the mechanism that, I guess, roughly 700 million years ago, that all of a sudden we get the flouriation of life into more complex forms?
Yeah, so there was some form of snowball Earth, certainly, I would say, around about 600 million years ago, going back a little earlier than that. There were three of them. And yes, it predated the Cambrian explosion, when we first see the large animals in the fossil record. So it almost certainly had something to do with oxygen at that point. That was a time in Earth's history where oxygen levels were beginning to rise. Now, oxygen permits things to happen that otherwise wouldn't happen. So it didn't drive the evolution of complex life, but it certainly made, I think, predation possible. You can't really have a food chain in the absence of oxygen. So as soon as you've got enough oxygen in the atmosphere, then you can begin to have food chains where things eat each other at several trophic levels.
And let me just ask, why is that? Is because oxygen gives you enough power to be motive that a life form can go out and seek another life form to devour?
It's really how much energy do you get out of what you eat. So if you burn something in oxygen, you are recovering the best part of 40% of the energy that was available in that food.
Oh, okay.
And so you eat a certain amount, and that's providing for your needs. Whereas if you're only fermenting, you only get less than 1% or around about 1% of the energy that was in that food out of it again. And that means if you're going down in increments that each kind of layer in a food web can only get 1% of the energy out again, then before you've gone through 2 or 3 steps, there's just not enough energy to sustain a population, even of cells. And so without oxygen, you really don't have much in the way of predation. And for the first 3.5 billion years of life on Earth, there wasn't really any predation. And it wasn't until the Cambrian explosion that we begin to, we see eyes, we see armor plating, we see legs and things, we see motility.
Yeah.
These were definitely the hunters and the hunted. And that's in the context of oxygen. So that's very much about why we see large complex animals at that time arising, because oxygen levels went up at that time. But it didn't happen with the bacteria. The bacteria didn't turn into kind of large complex predators at that time. And the reason why not seems to be to do with the structure of the cells that make up bacteria compared to the structure of the cells that make up the eukaryotes, animals and plants and so on. And that's a problem that goes back much further. It goes back 1 billion years before the Cambrian explosion, if not more than that, to a period of Earth history that we know much less about. But the origin of these complex cells that make up animals, that's 1 billion years before the first animals, and they seem to have been effectively idling for a lot of that time. Nothing much happened in the history of life that we're aware about beyond the evolution of those cells.
Well, you talked about oxygen levels, and we also talked a bit about the snowball Earth. I'm wondering, to what degree does the makeup of the Earth's crust and continental drift, what role has that played in life on Earth? Because depending on where the continents are, where sea currents may be, it would seem to me that that would be a particular force in driving the weather on even early Earth when the sun wasn't as hot as it is now. Is there any correlation, do you think, between, say, I know there was Pangea several hundred million years ago, 1 billion or so years ago, there was Rodinia, I think, when all the continents were together. Is there any correlation between, say, the gathering of continents into one supercontinent 3 or 4 times over the Earth's history that we can tell, and say, well, when the continents were all lumped together 2 billion years ago, this is when this happened, and then 500 million years later they were lumped together again and this happened? Have we been able to get any correspondence like that?
I mean, there are several correspondences like that, and how important they are really depends on who you talk to. I think there's a general rule that biologists will tend to look for biological reasons for events in Earth history. So the Cambrian explosion, for example, I will tend to look for causes such as rising oxygen causing predation. Now, geologists would tend to see geological reasons for that kind of thing. So the snowball Earth, for example, part of the reason for that was exactly that the continents were all gathered together close to the equator. And therefore the conditions at a global level were suitable for reflecting light back, and you can have a spread of ice to form a snowball Earth. Now, the answer is probably a little bit of both of the geologist view of the world and the biologist and chemist view of the world. But the two groups talk to each other not as much as they probably should. There's a limited number of people who really are interested in these kind of deep evolutionary, historical, global questions. And I think they're talking to each other much better now than perhaps was the case 10, 20 years ago. So we don't really know. For example, 2 billion years ago, there was an event known as the Great Oxidation Event. And the complex cells arose after that, almost certainly, maybe a couple of 100 million years after that. We don't really know when. But what brought that on? It could have been life. It could have been cells themselves that were, for example, photosynthesizing and producing oxygen for the first time. And the oxygen in the atmosphere oxidized all the methane, which is a potent global greenhouse gas, and so the temperatures plummeted. So that might have been part of the answer, in which case it's a biological point. Or it may have been that the composition of the the metals coming out of volcanoes, for example, began to shift, and so the methanogens began to die back in a way that shifted this balance. It may be as well something to do with the way in which the weathering from continents was working, so to do with how many nutrients were being put into the oceans, and that would depend on tectonic forces. So how much mountain building is going on, how high are the continents relative to other periods in Earth history, and we don't know the answers to a lot of those questions yet. It undoubtedly played a role, and there's a constant interchange between geology and biology right through Earth history.
When you talk about this great oxidizing event and it possibly being caused by life, I'm just wondering, it would sound to me that you're not someone who would subscribe to, say, the hard view of, say, someone like Lovelock about Gaia, but does life have a mediating mediating effect on the planet that makes the planet more conducive for more life by now, at least, if not in the beginning, at least now currently?
Yes, life provides all kinds of feedback mechanisms, both negative and positive, and it certainly makes it changes the behavior and the patterns and the climate and the temperature of the planet. There's no question about that. So I suppose that's a relatively soft form of Gaia. It's what most people would now call Earth systems science, and there's no doubt about any of that. I think the hard version of Gaia, I'm not sure that even Jim Lovelock would subscribe to the idea that the Earth is literally a living planet in the sense that it's an organism. I think that was a strong metaphor, and it certainly influenced a lot of people and brought people into science. But I don't think there's many people who see the Earth literally as a living organism now. But it is life is part and parcel of the way that the planet operates, and it would be an utterly different and unrecognizable planet if life were not providing all these feedbacks. The whole composition of the atmosphere is utterly different to the conditions that must have given rise to life in the first place. And the atmosphere with all this oxygen and so on is a product of photosynthesis, but not only photosynthesis, because for a long period the oxygen was being consumed at the same rate that it was accumulating, and so there wasn't any. Essentially, there was very little oxygen for a long time. So again, what changed? We're not sure. But around the time of the Cambrian explosion was the time that oxygen levels were going up, and again, it's a complex interplay between the planet and life itself, which changed the atmosphere and made the complex life that we have around us possible at all.
Well, it seems that eukaryotes are different from the other two domains that you mentioned, and I could be wrong, in that sex came along. Is there any reason that you think that, number one, there are just two sexes, male and female generally, rather than 5 or 3 or 8? And what advantages, other than, say, just genetic mixing of material, does sex provide, if any?
Well, yes. Sex was considered to be the queen of evolutionary problems for a lot of the 20th century, and it's not really obvious exactly why it exists. There have been lots of theories about it, and in fact, they probably all amount to much the same thing. So it is to do with recombining genes on chromosomes. So instead of natural selection can only see an entire cell or an entire chromosome, because all the genes are always fixed in the same place relative to each other, what sex is doing is shifting genes around continuously, or different forms of genes. And so it allows natural selection to see each gene individually. And that means that good forms or bad forms of each gene, the bad forms can be weeded out, the good forms can be selected for. And you can see that then in the context of, for example, people may have heard of the Red Queen hypothesis, the idea that you have to keep running to stay in the same place. So we're having sex to produce variation that, for example, parasites, viruses, or other parasites, bacteria, and so on. We're constantly providing them with obstacles to being able to wipe out not just individuals but whole populations. If we were all exactly the same, then we would all be vulnerable to the same parasite and maybe wiped out. So that's one possibility. But it also provides, better ways of adapting to changing environments to each other in many ways, and to ourselves. So the mitochondria that I've mentioned already, they were bacteria once. They retain genes of their own, and those genes are absolutely important to our existence. Without them, we simply wouldn't exist, and complex life would not exist at all, in my view. So why do we have two sexes? Well, the deepest difference between the two sexes, when you get right down to this cell level and you go back as far as you can in time and try and work out what the difference is, it seems to be the inheritance of mitochondria. So women pass on mitochondria in their egg cells, and men don't. In the sperm, the mitochondria are pretty rigorously excluded from the egg. When they get into the egg, they are killed within the egg. They're broken down. And this, we see the same thing in single-celled seaweeds, for example, and in fungi. One sex passes on the mitochondria. That is the mother by definition. The other sex does not. And we've been doing some theoretical work, population genetics, and we've shown that effectively what sex is doing is it's increasing variation in a population at the level of the genes in the nucleus. And so we are all different to each other. And what having two sexes is doing is essentially the same thing with the mitochondrial DNA. So one sex is passing it on, the other sex is not. And because that's a form of sampling, and there's all kinds of other forms of sampling of populations of cells, these mitochondria, we end up with slightly different populations of mitochondria in all of us too, in pretty much the same way that sex generates this variation. Having two sexes generates the variation in the mitochondrial genes that allows us to weed out bad mitochondria and select good ones.
Well, it may not be as obvious a difference as sex, but to me, photosynthesis is an interesting idea. And I wonder why with eukaryotes, for example, it's only occurred, as far as I know, within plants. Why haven't fungi or why haven't animals developed it? I mean, we've seen evidence of convergent evolution throughout life's history. It would seem a lot easier that big creatures like us or the giant sauropods in the dinosaur age would have, if they had developed and been greenish and developed, it would have been much easier than just eating all day. Why has photosynthesis developed in anything other than plants? And if not, why not? Is that even a valid question?
Well, it has. It has in the sense that there are, for example, there's a green sea slug called Elysia, which eats algae, and it sequesters the chloroplasts that do the photosynthesis into its own tissues, and it is therefore photosynthetic, and it's able to get a small proportion of the energy that it needs from that photosynthesis. And I think that's the real difficulty with it for an animal, is it just doesn't provide the amount of energy that's really required to live an active lifestyle. There's a good reason why plants are effectively not motile. They don't run around and do things. They don't get enough energy per minute, per gram from photosynthesis to sustain an active lifestyle in that way. And so it can help if you're on the edge of a survival rations, if you like, then doing some photosynthesis on the side can help you. And we do see these examples like the green sea slugs that do that. But it's really incompatible with the more active lifestyle. But there's a deeper mystery about photosynthesis because it arose only once, the form that we know about in plants, where oxygen is the waste product and it's released into the atmosphere. Well, plants didn't invent that themselves. They acquired it, and they acquired it in the same way that we acquired our own mitochondria. They engulfed their ancestors, the algae in the oceans. They engulfed a cyanobacterium, which is to say a bacterial cell that does photosynthesis, and that's where they got it from. Now, if we go back further, more broadly across the whole domains of bacteria and archaea, well, that form of photosynthesis really only arose once there too in the cyanobacteria or their ancestors, and so it's arguably the most important process in the history of our planet, because without photosynthesis, life here would never have got beyond single-celled forms. Really, we would never see animals without oxygen in the atmosphere. And that oxygen came from photosynthesis, and that form of photosynthesis is ancient, but only occurred in one group of bacteria. Why, we don't know, but it's not an easy thing to do, to find a way of channeling the energy of the sun into splitting water We're struggling to do it ourselves. We can do it ourselves now. It has been a relatively recent development, and we don't do it yet with the efficiency of photosynthesis. It's an intrinsically difficult process. And again, where events that only happened once in 4 billion years of Earth history, you have to say, well, is that a freak accident? Would it have happened the same way somewhere else? Or were we lucky that it worked out that way here?
Well, about 20 years ago in the 1990s, there were dueling books about the Burgess Shale in popular science. Stephen Jay Gould put out a book, and then a few years later, Simon Conway Morris basically debunked
Sure.
most of that book. And I'm just wondering, both, though, hold up the idea, even though they interpreted things differently, that during the Cambrian explosion, a whole variety of possible bodily forms of life, the form of actual animal life especially, arose, and then a lot of it just went extinct. For example, I was talking about symmetrical, the right-left symmetry of most vertebrates and things of that nature. The fact that we have mouths and anuses is. Do you think that with a slightly different tail, that we could have had again a very different body plans for animals?
Yes, I imagine that we could have done. Simon Conway Morris really emphasizes what he calls convergent evolution, not just him, that's the term for it. And Stephen Jay Gould emphasized contingency in evolution. So, and both exist. And so the question is really which played the more dominant role over evolutionary history. And there are certain moments, as I say, for example, the evolution of photosynthesis. So we're going way back before the animals here, or the evolution of the complex eukaryotic cell. These are things that only happened once in all of Earth's history, and they look very contingent. We don't know that for sure, but it's very easy to imagine that if you were to wind back the clock, that you could easily have an Earth which was just full of bacteria and nothing else. There seems to be nothing to do with infinitely large populations of bacteria that will give rise to large complex life. The Cambrian explosion itself is difficult to interpret because it almost certainly happened very quickly because the small animals were already there and for whatever reason were possibly not for a long time, but they were there before the Cambrian explosion itself, and the explosion was driven really by in the context of higher oxygen levels, and they rose pretty quickly in the space of a few million years. Then you have this context where predation is possible, and that was what was driving it. So do you have to then have animals which are symmetrical, on a right-left symmetrical? Well, it certainly makes things much easier in many ways. We do see animals that are not, so we have radial symmetry in starfish, for example, and jellyfish and things like that. It would be perfectly possible to have a world dominated by radially symmetrical animals, or perhaps possibly any other kind of shape. There's quite a complex developmental path to being bilaterally symmetrical, and it's possible that wouldn't work out that way again. On the other hand, it's also quite likely that it works particularly well, that if you want to move around, then having legs on opposite sides of a body is probably a better way of doing it. So it may be that you would see that again, and that it's convergent evolution because it's the best way of doing it. We see that, for example, with wings. Flight arose independently in birds and in bats and in various insects and so on, and in the pterosaurs. So each group evolved wings. That's convergent evolution. If you want to fly, you've got to have some kind of an aerofoil. And same thing with eyes, for example. Eyes arose on at least 60 or 70 different occasions, and in the case of the octopus eye, it's almost exactly the same as the human eye, but it evolved completely independently by convergent evolution. You end up with almost the same design. So I think a great deal of what we see around us is that way because it's the best way for something to be, even if we don't know all the reasons, or at least if not optimal, then a very good way to be. But I think there are moments in Earth's history, like the origin of complex cells and photosynthesis, where it could easily have never happened.
Well, just to get a little bit speculative, I read a book, I forget the author's name, called The Life as We Don't Know It, where it was speculated that in the RNA world, presumably there was a period early in Earth's life history where DNA hadn't hadn't formed yet, and most life, if you want to call it that, was based upon the RNA molecules, which are simpler than DNA, and that we could have, according to some people who subscribe to it, that there could be life forms on Earth that we might not recognize as DNA-based life forms. Do you find any truck with that idea, or do you think that's just too speculative?
I don't think there's much chance that we're going to find life that's not this way, but I don't think that means we shouldn't look,
Yeah.
because we can always be surprised. I think there's few things that scientists like better than being basically wrong, because it opens up a whole new playing field. It changes the way that everything is shaped. So I don't think that it's been called a shadow biosphere. I don't think that we're going to find a shadow biosphere, but I think we'd be stupid not to look. And if we did find one, it would be tremendously exciting. But I think we have to be level-headed about these things as well and think, well, what are the likelihood of that? Why is life based on DNA, for example, rather than RNA? Well, there's a very good reason for that, which is that RNA is just not stable enough to code for anything more complex than a virus, and a rather simple virus like HIV at that. So it's for exactly the reasons that it was probably a predecessor to DNA in an RNA world, as you said, which is to say it can catalyze reactions as well as being a replicator. For exactly those reasons, it's not particularly good at being a replicator. It's not stable enough to encode large organisms. And so there are these structural constraints on why life is this way. And there could be other forms of DNA or something very similar to it, which are much more stable than RNA. We don't know enough of the context about how life started in the first place to say we got DNA from RNA and it had to be that for these reasons. It could have been different, but it would almost certainly have had to have been stable enough to have a large amount of code for something even as complex as a bacterial cell, which is a tremendously complex system when you're down at the level of the molecules that comprise it. And so there's probably only a limited number of ways that it actually could be. There was a famous example a few years ago. People found some bacteria in Lake Mono, which seemed to have arsenic instead of phosphate in DNA, and there was a big furore about that, and it turned out that this is in fact not true. They don't. But a lot of people, even before it had been demonstrated that they don't have arsenic in the backbone of DNA, various chemists have pointed out that on the basis of the chemistry of arsenic, it's simply not possible and it must be mistaken. And they were correct, as it turned out. I think there's a lot that chemists can say about structures of molecules that can guide us down particular paths and say, well, DNA is this way for these reasons. It's actually remarkably close to RNA. There's only two small molecular differences between RNA and DNA, and they give rise to an entire world of difference in the possibilities of life.
Yeah, water and energy seem to be the two constants of life on Earth here. And we've now found water, at least ice on the moon. We found water, at least ice on Mars. We have found it on Europa and a number of the other moons farther out in the solar system where the sun's energy is far diminished compared to here. Do you think that it's possible that we may find microbial forms of life or even small virus-like things in these pockets of ice, especially on a place like Mars that once had warmer conditions? I mean, this is outside your purview, I know, but I'm just speculating.
No, it's actually very close in some respects because the kind of hydrothermal vent that I think life started in on Earth really requires a reaction. It has got nothing to do with volcanoes and magma or anything like that. It's in fact a reaction, a chemical reaction between rock and water. And a specific type of rock, minerals like olivine, which are rich in iron and magnesium. Now, olivine makes up most of the mantle of the Earth, and olivine is one of the most ubiquitous minerals in the universe, as far as we know. You find it in interstellar dust, and it's almost certainly going to be present in large amounts on any wet, rocky planet. And as soon as we're starting to talk about wet, rocky planets, that includes Mars in the past. It includes the icy moons, Europa, Enceladus, and so on, where we know almost for certain that these same kinds of reactions, it's a process called serpentinization, which is a word that tends to put people off a little bit. But it just describes this reaction between olivine and water to produce a mineral called serpentinite, which is where the name comes from, serpentinization. And that gives off these gases like hydrogen, for example, and it forms these vent systems which are ideal electrochemical reactors for producing life. And so wherever we see a wet rocky planet, we should expect to see these kind of reactions and a fairly healthy possibility that we'll see at least bacterial life. Now, in the case of Mars, it's either a dead planet or it's nearly a dead planet. We know that since the time of Jim Lovelock, who pointed out that the atmosphere is essentially in equilibrium, and that the difference between Earth and Mars is that the atmosphere on Earth is massively out of equilibrium to where it would be if it was a dead planet. But that doesn't mean to say that there's not some cells hanging on in the below the surface in Mars, and that there's enough water for that. It's just that their turnover, their output, if you like, is not enough to be really detectable on a planetary scale. So I think a lot of people now would be quite disappointed if it turned out that there was no life anywhere in the solar system, at least bacteria.
Yeah.
I think most people would hope for that and expect to see that. But I don't think many people would expect to see anything other than bacteria. And on Mars, probably hanging on by their fingertips, if you like, to a very, very difficult existence.
Well, I want to turn to an earlier book of yours, since we've talked more about sort of the chemistry and sort of the mechanics of life, energy, water, and whatnot. An earlier book that you wrote was called Power, Sex, Suicide, and its subtitle was Mitochondria and the Meaning of Life. I want to talk about one of the things that puzzles, I guess, some people, and that's the fact of why do we age. My wife has worked, and she tells me about telomeres and whatnot, and I've read how, for example, jellyfish seem to be immortal in that they can just sort of backward age themselves and split, and they, and cancer cells, certainly, when a cancer forms, a cancer is a runaway process where it's just reproducing the same cells. So why, other than sex, it would seem to me that the fact that we age and die off is very important. Otherwise, this planet would soon be overrun and be consumed by life. How did aging come about, do you think? I mean, is that, that seems a very simple question that people ask, but I don't think I've ever seen really books or people even addressing, why do we age? Why is a human lifespan 70 or 80 years? Why might a dinosaur or a turtle be 100 years or more?
Well, I mean, there are plenty of books on it, and we know a lot about it, but I don't think, again, that there's necessarily a whole lot of agreement between people who work on different aspects of the problem. And there's no reason at all why, lots of different reasons would all contribute to it. There are, evolutionary reasons connected with, for example, sex, exactly that, and the fact that bacteria don't do sex mean that they don't age in the same way that we do. So evolution is about reproduction. It's about not really the survival of the fittest so much as the reproduction of the fittest. And that means that we need to allocate resources towards producing offspring, and that tends to compress resources into the earlier part of lifespan. So there's some truth in that, undoubtedly, that if you're able to have 5 children within a certain window of time, then you're more likely to leave copies of yourself. And if that means that you actually go into aging afterwards and you die catastrophically sometimes, I mean, there are examples of, for example, Pacific salmon that basically fall to pieces after having sex. That's an extreme end of this. More broadly, though, the lifespan depends or varies with metabolic rate. So we have a relatively slow metabolic rate compared to, for example, mice or rats, and they live for 2, 3, 4 years. We are much larger, and we have a slow metabolic rate, but our lifespan is proportional to the metabolic rate. A lot of people may have heard about that in terms of a fixed number of heartbeats, for example. It goes back to Raymond Pearl in the 1920s. Now, there's also truth in that, and how all these factors interrelate with each other is not entirely clear. I do think that this is probably quite important, but it certainly doesn't provide a fixed limit on life, because birds, interestingly enough, have a faster metabolic rate than we do. And relative to that metabolic rate, they live a long time. So you'll see, for example, an albatross could live for well over 100 years. Though a lot of the actual lifespans of wild animals we don't know with much certainty. So we have a kind of almost a U-shaped relationship that tortoises, I think you mentioned, live an awful long time. And they live an awful long time in part because their metabolic rate is so slow. And birds live a long time, even though their metabolic rate is very fast. So we're at the kind of the bottom of this curve. We're in the worst of both worlds, that we have a faster metabolic rate than a tortoise, but we don't seem to have offset that against lifespan in the way that birds have done. And this still, I think, relates to the rate of free radical leak from the mitochondria, what's known as the free radical theory of aging. And a lot of people are pretty skeptical of this idea now, because if the reason we age is because our mitochondria are producing free radicals, then the one thing you'd want to do about it would be to take antioxidants to prolong your life. And the one thing that science has proved beyond any reasonable doubt over the last 20 or 30 years is that taking antioxidants does not increase lifespan. Sometimes doing the opposite can. Taking pro-oxidants might. And a lot of the benefits of eating fruit and vegetables and so on, we've traditionally taken it to be related to antioxidants, but it's probably related, in fact, to a balance of pro-oxidants and antioxidants in them. And so just taking antioxidant supplements, unless you have a really unbalanced and bad diet, is not going to help you live longer or cure any disease.
And a lot of that stuff too, I've read, it has to be in its natural form. For example, if you take carotenoids just as a pill, it doesn't work the same way as it does in a carrot.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are scores of different carotenoids in a carrot, and we probably need that balance.
Yeah.
Whereas just taking one effectively upsets the natural balance and puts the body out in ways that we don't really understand a great deal about. So taking very large quantities of very particular dietary supplements is not as good a way of doing it as simply having a balanced diet of fruit and vegetables. So I don't think that the free radical theory of aging is dead, but it's certainly not mainstream in the way that it was 10 or 15 years ago. So the question then becomes, well, if free radical leak from mitochondria is really one of the factors driving aging, then why is it that taking antioxidants doesn't work? And the answer to that is almost certainly that free radicals are signals. You can think of it like smoke. With a fire alarm, that if you effectively knock out the fire alarm, then by taking antioxidants, then you've got a more serious problem. It's important that we are able to detect the smoke, and the smoke are these free radical signals, and so they're an integral part of our lives, our healthy lives. And so the problem becomes more complex than it was this original black and white view: free radicals are bad, antioxidants are good. It's certainly not like that. And how all of this plays out is not really clear. What is clear and what is really very hopeful, I think, is that in evolutionary terms, lifespan is very, very flexible. It's very easy for lifespan to change. And we probably doubled our own lifespan, if not trebled our own lifespan, over the last 2 or 3 million years, compared to the great apes, chimpanzees, and so on. We live a lot longer than we ought to in terms of metabolic rate. Birds, as I say, live for much longer than they ought to. If you compare a pigeon with a rat, a pigeon will live 10 times longer than the rat, even though they have the same metabolic rate and the same body size. So from an evolutionary point of view, it's very, very easy to change lifespan, and if you live 10 times longer, then you probably end up with the same diseases. It's just over a 10-fold longer time period. The real difficulty, I think, comes with the complexity of systems like the human brain, where it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to replace individual neurons. And it's hard to prolong the life of neurons that have already been alive for 120 years. It's difficult to see how you get beyond that. It's not intractable, but it's not an easy problem at all. So I think the real problem with human aging is the difficulty of keeping these post-mitotic tissues, cells that are no longer dividing, alive and well and healthy.
Well, I want to wrap this interview up by focusing on the idea of meaning that you have spoken of in the book Power, Sex, and Suicide. And, as I said, we're simians, and the simian mind, the complex mind, we like to hold things, we like to ask these questions. But the most important question always seems to be why. Why is something like that? And, a lot of people would argue that the other questions are within the purview of science, but why is outside the purview of science. So, for example, we could talk about the Big Bang, but to ask why was there a Big Bang is sort of like asking why is there a God or not. What did you mean, and what is your proposal about what the meaning of life is in the book? Is it in that why format, or is it more of a technical meaning of life?
Well, I love asking why questions, and a lot of scientists are suspicious of it as well. I have to admit, it's not only people outside science who say that the why is somehow outside the remit of science. A lot of scientists also think that why is outside the remit of science, and science is about how. Um, I find it quite difficult sometimes to tell the difference between a why and a how question. They're often just different ways of phrasing the same question, it seems to me. And I find that I'm interested in why. That's really my motivating question. Why is it this way? Did it have to be this way? Could it have been a different way? Um, and
But
so
let me just ask
these are,
philosophically, doesn't that often lead to an infinite regress? Why? And then you get back to a point where you just can't go asking why anymore. It just is. You get a just
yeah,
because answer.
well, it may do. I don't go back that far. Um, so I'm not going back to the Big Bang, which is where you're beginning to get into the infinite regress territory.
Yeah.
Asking why was life this way is a question that goes back to the origin of life on a planet that was a sterile, wet, rocky planet.
Yeah.
And there's no infinite regress there because we don't know the answers, but we've got some good insights into where the answers might lie, and we've got some good insights into, as we've been talking about, why do cells use DNA rather than RNA? Why are they made up of cells rather than viruses? There's very good answers to those questions, and those are why questions, and they're questions that guide you down a certain path of interpretation. And most of that is science. And it leads in the end to questions like why are there two sexes, and why are the sexes the way that they are? By this time, we're getting into questions that do touch on the meaning of life. And they are questions, I suppose, that can be upsetting to people if they think that science is invading the territory that should be religious, or should be, if not religious, something to do with philosophy rather than science. I think that any philosophy or theology has to deal with the reality insofar as we can understand it, and so it has to interact with science and has to try to process what science is saying about the world. From my own point of view, science therefore does have things to say about meaning, because if a lot of the world is spinning around because of relations between the two sexes and we don't know why there are two sexes, then we don't really have any insight into that meaning at all. So I think science certainly is not the last word on any of these questions, but I think it has to be part of it, and it gives us great insights into, we've been talking about aging. That has tremendous meaning for people. The fact that we're all going to age, we're going to die, we're going to get Alzheimer's disease. Does that have any meaning? Of course, it has huge meaning for everybody. Can science do anything about it? Yes, if we think about it in the right way. So I think science is intimately linked with our own meaning in our own lives, and why we're here, and why life has to be harsh sometimes in the way that it is, and beautiful, in love, and so on. Why is it this way? These are questions of science as much as they are of philosophy to me.
But do you make the distinction, say that, do you ask why, what is the meaning of life? Don't you then have to say, well, what would the cosmos be without life? So in order to get what the thing is, you have to look at it if it wasn't.
I don't really worry myself too much with that kind of question, I have to say. I'm fairly sure that the universe would be out there anyway, regardless of whether there's sentient life forms capable of seeing it or not. Um, and I have to say that my title, Mitochondria and the Meaning of Life, there was an overtone of Monty Python in that as well. I don't know if people pick up on that or not. I did do an interview once in Canada where they had the theme tune of Monty Python's Meaning of Life playing as my introduction. So, and they had quite a go at me on that occasion. So it was partly tongue in cheek, but I do think, in a serious way, that science has things to say about the meaning of our lives. Yes, but I wouldn't go into cosmic terms about the meaning of the universe. I wouldn't personally go into that territory.
Well, let's end this segment. In the final segment, I'll just give you a few closing remarks and what you have in the future. So we'll do that in a moment. I've been speaking with Nick Lane about life and various aspects of it. Let me just ask about your personal future. What is the next book or idea that you're working on? And also within your field, the study of life in its many forms. What do you think, or what would you like to see in your lifetime if you had one big question answered? So let me just go personally and then more broadly.
Well, I'm not working on any book at the moment. I need to put together a proposal for the next one, but I spend most of my time doing science in the lab and teaching, and so it takes me a while between books to kind of gird up my loins again to face the next one. I say face the next one. It's a wonderful thing to write books and to conjure with these questions. But it's quite exhausting when you add it on to the rest of being a scientist, and I need a break for a couple of years before I really get on with the next one. I will be starting that soon, and it will still be dealing with similar themes about the evolution of life and what it means for us. What I'm doing on a daily basis, we're doing some very exciting work on the origin of life in hydrothermal vents. These are questions that can be addressed in the lab. We're not expecting cells to come crawling out of the top of it. We want to ask, can this particular reaction we think between hydrogen and carbon dioxide, will that happen under these specific set of conditions that we think it should? And so they're very restricted and limited questions, really, but they're exciting questions because they're part of this bigger question about how does life arise from a sterile planet. What would I like to see in my own lifetime? Well, I would love to see this question about the origin of life answered in a way. I think we will. I think we have good ideas about it now, but there are very, very difficult sticking points at the level of the complexity of machines like ribosomes that read off DNA and RNA into proteins. How did they arise? Because really, before you have a working cell, you've got to have these ribosomes. How they arose, I think we're still quite a long way from knowing that. We're quite a long way then from knowing whether or not life is almost inevitable on a planet with the right set of conditions, or if there's some freakiness involved in self-organization of matter to form molecular machines. These are the sticking points at the moment. I think the other sticking point in science, the two biggest questions to me as a biologist in science, the origin of life is one of them, and consciousness is the other. And again, I have the feeling that we have no real insight yet into exactly what consciousness is. I am let's say, a simple biochemist. I see these things in quite simple terms, and consciousness to me is about feeling. Why do we feel something? Why do we feel hunger? Why do we feel love? Why do we feel pain? Why questions again, all of them. And that has to do with somehow the neurons, physical properties of neurons that we know about, depolarization, ions passing from one side of a membrane to the other. How does that give rise to a feeling of anything at all? I think we don't really have a good answer to that question yet. So these are two questions I hope that I would have insights to in my lifespan, but I think they will take most of my lifespan before we really do.
Yeah, there's a good chance that by mid-century, whether it's the U.S. or Russia or an international team or China, that some humans may land on Mars, and more than likely, they, unlike the rovers, are going to be going looking in these places where there's water. If you were to put your money on it, do you think that if life is found, and first, we may not find life, we may find, but if life is found on Mars, do you think it will be radically different than life on Earth, or very similar, which would give credence to panspermia?
Well, I think it would be very similar, but I don't think it would necessarily give credence to panspermia. It's quite possible that that bacteria can travel between planets, and life could have been seeded on Earth from Mars or vice versa. Panspermia is not a helpful way of thinking about the origin of life, because it just said it came from somewhere else. We don't know where that was. So it's not a helpful, constructive way of seeing the question. If you assume that it's not panspermia, then there's something about conditions on Earth or on Mars that are conducive to giving rise to life, and you can think scientifically, you can structure the question, you can do experiments. It may be that it's all wrong and we disprove it. What I would hope for, I would love to find life on Mars, and I would love it if it was bacteria. I wouldn't expect anything other than bacteria, but that there were differences. That, for example, it doesn't use DNA, or if it does use DNA, it has a very different code. I would expect, just from the principles of chemistry, that it would be carbon-based, that it would be cellular, that it would have that it would operate in water, that it would then have lipid membranes of some sort. But I wouldn't expect to see the same lipids that we use on Earth. I would expect different lipids with different properties, but also forming bilayers in the same way that our own ones do. I would expect that it would be proteins, because amino acids, we find them everywhere around the universe, and they're particularly good at what they do. So I would expect that in many ways it would be very reminiscent of life on Earth, reminiscent to the point that it would be cells that we recognize of the same kind of size and shape, and that we would think that it was probably a contamination from Earth, until we see that they have a very different genetic code, for example. I think most scientists would be thrilled if that were the case, and again, I would hope to see that in my own lifetime.
Yeah. Well, anyone who's interested in the things that Nick and I have been discussing, I will link to his website below this video. It's nick-lane.net, and you can contact him there or look up further much of his work. And so thanks again, Nick, for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.